Hey everybody, I'm DJ Sixsmith. Welcome to Sit Down. Bruce Levine is here with us. He's got his brand new book, Thaddeus Stevens, Civil War Revolutionary. Professor Levine, really nice to meet you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you? Please call me Bruce.
All right, I'll keep it at Bruce. Listen, you have studied the Civil War for a long time. You've been a great professor, and I'm really interested to talk to you about your new book because, listen, you are obviously incredibly familiar with Thaddeus Stevens, but a lot of people may not be, and it feels like his story may have been lost in history. So what was it like putting this book together?
Challenging. It was challenging putting it together. It's not like nobody has written a biography of Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, especially in the 19th century, there were a number of them written, and even more recently than that. But somehow he has managed to evade a good deal of public attention. And as with other figures like Lincoln, for example, there's no diary. So trying to figure out the inner life of this person is tough. And the cherry on top is the fact that Thaddeus Stevens' handwriting was almost illegible. And even his correspondents complained to him, how do you expect me to read this letter? And all sorts of things that he wrote that we have remain terra incognita for historians. Yeah, still, it was exciting. Once you found a way to get past that, it's an exciting investigation.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it makes it a little bit challenging when you can't read somebody's handwriting, but like you said, it's exciting because here's somebody who, as history has shown, was well ahead of everybody else when it comes to his thoughts on slavery, when it comes to his thoughts on equality, even ahead of President Abraham Lincoln. So what was it like diving into that part of the story about this guy who was really a leader at a time when people weren't talking about equality in the same way?
It was, well, as I said, it was not only exciting, it was inspiring. I first came across Thaddeus Stevens in college when I took a course on what was called Black history. And I read a history of this era by the great Black historian W.E.B. Du Bois, and then came across Thaddeus Stevens. And the more I learned about him, the more interesting he became. And so has really been a hero of mine for most of my life. But it wasn't until I actually began researching this book that I began to discover just how interesting he was and how actually complicated his story was.
What would you say is most complicated about his story?
Well, this man winds up being one of the most small d democratic politicians in the country. Not only with respect to African Americans, but really almost everyone. He's in favor of women's rights. He's in favor of women's suffrage. He defends the reputation of Native Americans. He criticizes the state of California for discriminating against Chinese immigrants. So it was startling to discover that at an earlier stage of his life, he was a good deal less democratic than that. In other words, his life was a journey from one set of ideas to another. This Civil War revolutionary wasn't a revolutionary in the egg. He had to become that person over the course of time. And that was both the challenge and the greatest source of interest to me. Just how had this occurred?
Yeah, what do you think influenced him the most in terms of coming to those views over time?
Well, he starts off with a number of strong influences. He's born and raised in the most radically democratic state in the Union, Vermont, which is really born in a war against the colony of New York for the sake of the rights of small farmers and the rights of a genuinely democratic form of state government. It's also the first state in the Union to specifically denounce slavery. He's born into a family of Baptists, and the Northern Baptists in that era traced their descent from the Puritans, who in turn were very active in the English Revolution of the 17th century that brought down the monarchy and beheaded the king. So the Baptists were pretty ardently democratic. in that period. He himself says that one of the great influences was being born into poverty. His family was a family of poor farmers that had reached Vermont from Massachusetts. And as a result, he says he came to identify with the downtrodden in general. So I think all these influences played a role. But it's the interaction between the person initially shaped by these influences and then what occurs in national politics, especially beginning in the 1830s, as the slavery issue comes further and further onto center stage, that leads him to basically take these old influences and focus them on the issue of slavery and make that the center of his outlook and his efforts.
It's really amazing how a person's life can influence who they are at one point and then at another. And then also when you're that first person out there and then other people start joining in. So did he get to experience a sense of vindication, once Lincoln and others really started to champion this cause? Or was he just like, hey, I've been waiting for all of you for a long time? Like, how did that go for him?
I think it's more, I've been waiting for you.
Yeah.
I don't find a great sense in what we have of his writings of vindication, of, you see, I was right. He's so focused on moving ahead. He's so focused on what's the next step. Okay, you finally caught up with me on this. Now do more, do more, do more. And he himself is learning to do more. So even he, at the very start of the Civil War, is not yet calling for the abolition of slavery throughout the country. It takes him a few months before he gets there. And he was not immediately in favor of voting rights for the emancipated slaves because he was afraid that they would be manipulated by the large landowners to whom they had to turn for employment. But he gets past that too. And so at each stage, Thaddeus Stevens' eyes are, as they say, on the prize. How do we make this still more democratic a country?
Yeah, how do we make this a better situation for everybody? And also, you speak to something that's really interesting to me is that his beliefs were evolving over time. And it seems like in today's political world, we are so tied to party that politicians aren't necessarily wavering on different issues, right? They're kind of just stuck with their party. So what is it like to actually look at politicians who were willing to change regardless of their party, just based on what was happening in the country at that time?
The contrast between what we live with today and what we see when we study that era could not be greater. Thaddeus Stevens, but not only Thaddeus Stevens, was a person, as you suggest, more concerned with questions of progress and policy than with party loyalty. Now, he certainly belongs to parties, and once he finds a party that he feels best embodies the policy options he prefers, he works hard for that party, but he's not very good about observing party discipline. And he's not very good about keeping his head down and keeping his voice muffled because somebody in the party tells him to.
What was his relationship with Lincoln like?
Well, it was basically cordial. What he says at one point is, what do we do with someone who's too slow? Says this in correspondence with another ally. What do we do with someone who's too slow, but who still is marching along our road, even if too slowly? And he says, the answer has to be praise him publicly and criticize him privately. Push him, keep pushing, keep pushing. And I think Lincoln respected Stevens, but found him a royal pain and a nuisance. But as he said of radical Republicans like Stevens, at least his face is facing Zionward. He also looked upon Stevens as someone headed in the same direction that he was, and probably welcomed the degree to which Stevens, in advocating more fundamental change, that Lincoln was advocating effectively helped to move public opinion in a direction that both pressured and allowed Lincoln to move along the same path subsequently.
That's really fascinating. And Bruce, I appreciate you pushing us forward, pushing us backward a little bit to study Thaddeus here. Thank you very much for the time and best luck with everything going forward. Right?
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.